Death of a game, Darkfall Online. Darkfall Online is a game that spanned near a decade of development, has had multiple sequels, or failed sequels, and reboots. It's a very polarizing game both by design and with by far one of the most rabid fan bases. It's a game that has been very dear to my heart since I first discovered Forumfall, or what Darkfallers refer to the forums as back then, back in 2008 through 2009. It's also a game that I have truly wished with every fiber of my being to succeed. My personal connection to it and the amount of turmoil and intrigue around Darkfall Online make it one of the perfect games to cover in the Death of a Game series. If you are familiar with what this series is already, feel free to click the screen or check the timestamp in the description to skip my explanation of what the series is. So what is Death of a Game? Death of a Game is a series where I take a look at games or companies that have died over the years and analyze the largest contributing factors and such. I will also talk about the legacy the said game or company left on the video game world. Understand that the first half of the video is a retelling of events and a history lesson on the game, while the second part serves more as an editorial on why I think the game in question or company in question failed. My reasons I outline for the game failing draw from player or developer testimonials, different statistics, and possible financial information. The second half of the video ultimately is my opinion, but it is an opinion that I have obtained through rigorous research as well as personal experiences. Darkfall Online, a full-loop, territory control-based MMO. It was a game that took what a game like UO, or Ultima Online did, and took it to the next level. It combined the brutality of a full-loot MMO, like Ultima Online, as well as their skill system, which was a skill system much like a skill system in Skyrim, out of 100, where each time you swing your weapon or you bang a pickaxe, you're going to get some skill gains versus having a combat level or an overall level like in, say, World of Warcraft. Darkfall Online also had elements from Assurance Call, like stat management and some of its quest features. It's a bit weird though to say that Assurance Call and Ultima are influences on Darkfall Online, because, well, Darkfall Online is actually rather old. Its history starts as old as 2000, where it spawned as an idea from a Norwegian company called Razor Wax. Razor Wax was founded by Klaus Gravdal, Kjetil Helland, and Ricky Sickinger. Razor Wax, soon after announcing their new idea for a title, partnered up with a few other developers, Zad Meldawi, Tassos Flamboros, and Spiros Lordanis. Tassos, of course, is known as the lead producer behind Darkfall, and a source of many people's scorn. The now named Aventurine team moved their company to Greece, where it would be easier to secure funds for creating their idea for an MMO, as well as have cheaper costs of operations compared to Norway. So Aventurine, now located in Greece, was going to begin development on Darkfall, which, as Klaus Grovdal, the lead developer, explained it as a next-generation online role-playing game that is highly geared towards player-run clans controlling kingdoms and capturing kingdoms from other player-run clans. Unlike other existing online games on the market, Darkfall was designed from the ground up to cater more towards the PvP-interested players. But we also have everything you would expect to find in an online role-playing game. Tons of quests, trade skills, magical items, and hundreds of different scary monsters lurking in dungeons. Most importantly to note though, for the focus of the game was the theme of control, whether it meant controlling resources, mob spawns, PvP territories, or even entire islands. Another quote from Klaus says that the basic concept of Darkfall was the struggle for power, the control between the different races. This, along with the player-run clans fighting for kingdoms, dungeons, and resources, was supposed to drive the game. It's important I mention these tidbits from devs of the game, these little quotes about the vision, at least the vision early on, because something you will begin to notice as the story of Darkfall unfolds is that there are some rather vocal vets of the game who claim to know what the game was meant to be, or should be. The next quote was really an eye-opener in retrospect. "Darkfall is freedom, to have fun straight from the box. There are no set grinds that you need to go through in order to enjoy the end game. There's no level grind, no money grind, no item grind. You should just go out and start having fun doing whatever it is you want to enjoy, and you can focus on PvP, on trade, or adventuring, or you can do it all." And I'm sure Darkfall players in unison around the world are chuckling at that comment. But it was the original vision for Darkfall. Nothing much was heard about Darkfall until 2005, where a sign-up page was made for a closed beta. The closed beta never came, but what did come was a near 2-minute gameplay. I was unable to locate this footage, but it was released as something to bide over the people who clearly were interested in the game, signed up to get the updates, and then realized that the beta wasn't going to come out. Tassos Flamboris explained that a decision had been made internally to devote additional money and resources into expanding the scope of the game, and this was cited as the reason for the delay. At E3 in the year 2006, Aventurine allowed select media to view a private build of the game, one that 10 Ton Hammer was able to get their hands on. It was a bit odd that for a game that was supposed to go into a closed beta was only able to be played by select media sites, but for those thirsty for information, like I was, they weren't really complaining. A quote from the hands-on article that 10 Ton Hammer published after playing Darkfall was, "After a brief introduction to the game, John drove the interview on by asking what the 3 things that they disliked most about the current MMOs and how they handled those elements in Darkfall. They answered immediately, saying that they were grinding, combat systems, and PvP. Darkfall, of course, aimed to solve all of these things. They wanted to make grinding less of a thing by having a free-form skill system, where you can choose the skills that you want to have, and then you actually have to go out in the world to increase those skills, so you're playing the game. Playing the game is quote-unquote your grind. Their idea of having a fun combat system was what many would consider a mix between an arena game like Quake and an RPG or MMORPG with skills and spells. Finally, the PvP aspect was the thing that really made Darkfall unique in the market, at least at the time. A time where PvE games reigned supreme. Darkfall boasted a full-loop PvP system with territory control. An announcement on the 11th of July 2006 stated that the new preparations were being made to push the game to a beta state. Aventurine was still unable to secure a publisher at the time, but they stated that they would self-publish if needed. Through the use of a news site RPG Vault, Tassos released new screenshots of the game. Some of the earliest screenshots of the game, in fact. Tassos boasted things like mobs being able to sense you and smell and sight and even your shadows, and this was probably done in part to help secure a publisher. But a publisher still didn't come. 6 months later, there was still no beta in sight. But on January 17th, 2007, Tassos made a post on the Darkfall forums stating that they were in talks with publishers and a beta client was playable on remote servers. The beta development milestone was met early in December. Since then, we've had a fully functional and stable beta build on remote servers, which is being patched regularly. At the moment, we're using part of the system to show the game to prospective partners, distributors, publishers, technology providers, and etc. Our motivation here is to provide the best quality assurance, distribution, and service for the game and its players, so we consider this to be a very important phase for Darkfall. And since people at this point were considering the game vaporware, or saying that the game didn't really exist, Tassos had this to say. It's easy to imagine that 5 minutes is all it takes to make an update. A developer will pop online to say hi, or that we could just appoint someone from the community to generate updates. Unfortunately, that's not the way it works in a professional environment. There are clear guidelines, we're bound by NDAs, all disclosure needs to be approved, as is the case with most development studios. Often due to disclosure issues, we're forced to be vague or talk around topics, and this is sometimes mistaken for coyness. by those who wish to interpret that way. Sorry. We get plenty of requests for publicity. Most of them involve us having to create regular content, or answering question interviews we've answered a million times before. Answers to questions we haven't answered before are often in the realm of information we're not allowed to discuss. All of our resources are put into game development. It's a stretch for us to deprioritize in order to create Darkfall features and updates. Even so, taking a look at what other MMOs in development are doing, it seems that we've produced more substantial content than most, while giving the community an extensive and truthful look under the hood. Where do we even start with this comment? This whole thing just reeks of bull. Specifically where they state that if they don't respond to criticism or the community, it's because they are busy. This is an excuse that Aventurine used very early on and continued to use throughout the entirety of Darkfall. But you have to remember, Darkfall was a great hope for many people, including myself, so we kept hoping that this small company, even with arrogant responses like that from their lead producer Tassos, we kept believing that this small company based in Greece would make the MMO that we all had been waiting for. As April 2008 came along, Aventurine came out and stated that Darkfall was feature complete. Darkfall is feature complete, and we're doing beta testing using professional testers, as we said before. This of course bred suspicion, or at least even more suspicion, because people were already assuming that the game wasn't going to launch or that the game was vaporware, but all of a sudden they had professional testers. 1 month later though, Aventurine released a statement on the matter. In this week's update, we answered questions from the community. There are several we haven't answered on purpose, hoping to demonstrate these instead. Many of you are asking for a video. We hear you, and we're on it as soon as we can. There's always many questions on the public beta and release dates. To this that I can say now, that during a planning meeting we determined that our launch will be inside 2008, with the public beta preceding it by a few weeks. This is official, and internally, we're a lot more specific, but pending an announcement, we cannot say more at this time. And not much was said more for a few months, until, well, August 29th, 2008, 3 years after the first closed beta was announced, Darkfall's official beta was announced and was accompanied, finally, by a slew of gameplay footage. This footage showcased things like PvP systems, siege warfare, ships and naval combat, as well as mounted combat and tons more. These videos got hundreds of thousands of views, and hype was boiling at that point. Early impressions of beta said things like, "This game is extremely solid, it just needs polish. They've done all the fundamentals right, and the remaining problems are things like UI, tweaking AI, and hardware compatibility issues." Another person said, "I've been testing for 3 to 4 days now and just seen a minimum of all the world has to offer, but I can give my compliments on the design. I tried most of these starter areas, and I felt like they were really well done. I find the surrounding area all varied and give a good sense of feeling of a real world." Although some of these were, well, early impressions, they were largely positive ones. Now, these were the only ones that were released by Tassos and Aventurine and crew, so maybe there were also naysayers, but it's fair to say that people saw great potential with the game. And for the landscape of 2008, the game, despite being an idea almost 8 years old, was still holding up to the test of time. Sure, some could look at the game for 2008 and say that the graphics seemed lacking, and the UI was certainly dated, but people were still having overwhelmingly positive impressions of the game. I am one of those people that certainly judge the game based on appearance alone, but when I got the chance to play the game, my opinion of it changed greatly, which is something that really can happen to you too. You might look at this video and see the gameplay on screen, but you can't really appreciate Darkfall for what it is unless you understand its core concepts. You play the game for yourself. But Aventurine deciding to launch Darkfall with 2 servers was a decision that many would argue would hurt the game tremendously. A launch date of January 22nd of 2009 was announced for Darkfall Online. As the community was used to with Aventurine, the game didn't launch on that date. It was pushed to February 18th, 2009. This was 4 years after the first beta was supposed to be playable. Because players had already played the beta of the game, they knew that despite Aventuring's goals of Darkfall not being grind-based, the game was heavily grind-based. So NA players, regardless of region, were going to play at EU launch, especially since Aventuring confirmed that they would allow these EU NA expats to transfer to NA servers when the NA server launched later that year. The game was pushed a few more days to the 25th, and pre-orders for Darkfall Online opened on the 19th. As the Darkfall Info website explained, the massive volume of hits to the site pretty much broke the systems in place, and Aventuring had to take the pre-order sales link down. In the days between the pre-order date and launch, there were apparently small windows of time where people managed to get in and secure a pre-order for the February 25th launch. From reading various forums, including the official Darkfall forums, it appears a rather large percentage of customers who wanted to get on launch date are out of luck, as the account system issues are still prevalent and performance issues are still being addressed. Reactions on the web vary from seething finger pointing at the developer to championing of Aventuring for wanting to resolve all major issues to letting any more players in the game. Unfortunately, some customers who claim that they have had successful pre-order experiences claim that they still cannot get authorization to play in the game. So although the game was supposed to be playable in just a few days, it was anything but buyable. Many of the players were unable to secure a copy of the game, including me. This is not to mention the issues Darkfall had at its actual launch. If you were actually able to secure a copy, you got into a server that took 12 hours into the supposed launch window for the game to, well, work because of a server issue that made mobs invisible. During this time, there were people that were already taking advantage of this, bugging out mobs and scoring nice loot. Players cried for a rollback, but no rollback happened. So the launch, of course, was anything but smooth, but to the dedicated fans of the game, especially those who hadn't had a chance to play in the beta, they were thrilled that they could finally play the game they saw as the savior to PvP MMOs. Likely due to its niche status, unsmooth launch, and non-existent PR, or at least mute devs, the game didn't really get a lot of press coverage. The biggest media site to cover the game was Eurogamer, where they rated the game as a 2 out of 10 with a scathing review. Tassos, in typical Tassos fashion, flexed his muscles and released information that showed that the Eurogamer had only played the game for 2 hours. Needless to say, the rabid fans were up in arms, and justifyingly so. In-game, they all took turns declaring war on Eurogamer's clan, showing that they stood in unison as a community. Something quite commendable for a community that was always at each other's throats. All of that drama aside, the EU launch was in full effect. NPC towns and early areas were bloodbaths. Massive guilds were fighting against one another in control of territories, and all the while players were finding more and more secrets to exploit and get ahead of the competition. According to Klaus Grovedal's LinkedIn, Darkfall sold over 300,000 copies throughout his life, though early launch was probably only a fourth of that number. Still, 10 to 20 man groups were considered small for the time, and this is crazy, especially if you consider that Darkfall was a mega server, and all of those players were on the same server. So you had these small 10 to 20 man groups running around, but you had groups as big as 100 people sieging. The NA launch was targeted later that year for July 13th, 2009. It was accompanied by a free expansion that added monster rebalancing, player housing, Darkfall's village system, the Nexus system, a character specialization system, the weather system, and special items. People who wanted to transfer to the NA server had to wait 3 months to give players time to catch up in regards to character advantage. Except this was one of the largest mistakes Aventuring made. This change of course split the population of the game. Not to mention that the NA players who would play on the EU servers to get their characters ahead are likely to be more hardcore, so when those players came over to the NA server, they dominated the server, and many of the NA players couldn't compete or quit out of frustration to how poor the whole thing was handled. Especially because by the time the characters from EU transferred over, Magic had taken over Darkfall, and a lot of those very hardcore players were very aware of that very early on. The second expansion hit Darkfall on December 2009. This expansion was titled Conquer the Seas. Conquer the Seas expansion was the largest changes that had happened to the game yet, with changes such as siege fixing, sea villages, trade routes, race differentiation, and even more ways to customize your character. It added a plethora of new mobs as well as quests, something that the game desperately needed for the time. But as 2010 closed in on Darkfall, so did the infamous no update period. Now this period actually did have changes technically, but many people classify the time between 2010 and 2012 as the dreaded 2 years without an update. They're more addressing the lack of crucial updates to the game, more so than the minor changes. To make matters worse, of course, in typical Aventurine fashion, they went radio silent during this time. January 2010, there was a QA that looked promising for Darkfall. This was the first time that Darkfall 2010 was mentioned. Dubbed Darkfall 2010, the expansion looks to focus on everything: armor dyeing, tons of new craftable items, more impact with a dynamic lore system, death animations, more PvP, PvE opportunities, better drops, wandering mobs, scavenging, mounts, and of course user interface upgrades, among others. But a year later, and there still wasn't any Darkfall 2010. Aventurine kept dodging questions concerning it, and said that, well, they maintain that they were still working on it. Exactly 1 year later, January 2011, there was an update on the Darkfall 2010 expansion, now to be named Darkfall Arena. In the recent blog post, Aventurine's own Tassos Flamboris goes on to talk about streamlining the world, removing dead spaces, and moving points of interest closer together. The racial areas are set to receive a complete layout change, and clan cities will also have their own layouts optimized. Each subcontinent is being revamped, with the addition of their own epic monsters to join the mobs already existing in the game. Current monsters will also be receiving a makeover from the art team, as well as player characters receiving their own graphical upgrade. No exact date was mentioned, but Aventurine stated that it would happen in 2011. 11 months later, in Aventurine, dubbing the update now Darkfall 2.0, released some tech demos showing off the new lighting and graphics of the game. As the article on screen shows, Tassos Flamboris told fans that there would possibly be a wipe due to the change being a near rewrite of the game. After 3 expansions, 2 siege system revamps, and 60 major content updates, we decided that we need to do things from scratch to satisfy the thousands of great ideas, suggestions, criticisms coming from the community, and to properly implement the lessons learned by us since Darkfall's launch. The Darkfall Epic blog was updated to showcase a substantial list of functions Aventurine will be overhauling with this update, and a reminder that Darkfall 2.0 is far closer to a brand new game than a simple expansion pack. When asked about if there was a wipe for the game, Aventurine still had been yet to come to a conclusion, noting that whether we wipe or not, the game is so different that it's of little significance. You should not be thinking in the current version of Darkfall when it comes to Darkfall 2.0, whatever that meant. With that response, many fans of course were up in arms. Not only did they have to deal with a year of no changes, along this timeline they kept promising things that were never delivered on. Not to mention the community had many complaints with the game, and the population continued to suffer tremendously. The first bit of the article was a bit disingenuous, because what classifies as a major content update is very subjective, and many fans would agree or wouldn't agree that Aventurine's classification of it was not very correct. Hilariously, Darkfall fans continue to refer to the changes as Darkfall 2010, and surely in slight. But as September 2012 came along, there was an announcement of an update coming soon, 2 years after the announcement of Darkfall 2010.
The idea to make a new game was something that developed over time. We started out wanting to add new features to the game, like, for example, a role system. We had discussed this. We also wanted to fix some legacy issues the game had, like the GUI, which we weren't happy with at all, and always wanted to do something with that, and the new player experience, etc. So one of the things we started working on was the siege system. We did a complete redesign, but we decided to add this to the current game. So our attitude at this point was, let's fix this game. The way we went about doing this expansion was starting with the lessons learned to date, and these were 1,000. There were things we wanted to do before the game came out that we never managed to do. There were things that came up along the way. There were inspirations that were given to us by the community. You know, it's impossible making a game to think of everything beforehand. So this is what Darkfall 2010 was. It was a massive expansion, and it kept getting bigger and bigger. And as it kept getting bigger, everyone's appetite for change and improvement also kept getting bigger. Trying to patch this game in such a big way, Darkfall 2010, it turned out to be a massive undertaking. And it's a little demotivating just trying to keep fixing something. When it makes you feel that something's broken and you've done something wrong, and then you just keep fixing it, fixing and fixing, trying to keep fixing something. When it makes you feel that something's broken and you've done something wrong, and then you just keep fixing it, fixing and fixing.
Turns out, despite Tassos directly stating that they weren't diverting resources to a sequel game, they were. This sequel was titled Darkfall Unholy Wars. Fans were livid. They had stuck with the game and company for 2 years with little to no update, following the breadcrumbs that Aventurine kept teasing out for a potential large expansion, only for it to be turned into a new game. Not only did they have to buy this game, they had to trust that it was done right this time, not something many people wanted to do with Aventurine's shaky track record. In typical Aventurine fashion, the game initially was supposed to launch on November 2012, but was pushed to April 16th, 2013 after one final delay. There was a playable beta in December 2012, really due to Aventurine feeling guilty about delaying the launch. Yeah, they only made the beta playable for players because of the massive amount of backlash that they were getting. Unholy Wars was disliked by many Darkfall core fans on the surface because, well, it was different. It was change. But after having time to dive into the game and really test it out, many disliked how clunky the combat felt, how it now had a class-based combat system, and how the game, well, was conceived in the first place. Because of such, many likely discredited it before it even launched. Like with the previous Darkfall game, it's hard to know how well the game sold, and the only stats I have to prove anything would be the numbers after Darkfall Unholy Wars was greenlit on Steam in late 2012. The numbers, of course, aren't very impressive, but many people, including myself, didn't use Steam to buy the game, so it's not really accurate. Still, I was there when the game was being beta tested, so close to launch, and how duping of items was rampant, and many clans were already quitting very early into the beta due to the constant wiping of the servers. Not to mention, there was a wonderful tasty meme titled Debug Mode during this time, where anytime anybody would complain about any hitching or lag in the game, Tassos would respond with, well, the game is still in debug mode. Unholy Wars somehow seemed to impress the users on Metacritic more than the previous Darkfall did, only by a few points of a margin, but this is probably attributed to Darkfall 1's terrible launch. MMORPG.com gave the game a fair grade of 76 out of 100, but despite Unholy Wars seeming to draw more attention from the general public and general media, it seemed to alienate its hardcores more. But that's because the previous players from Darkfall 1 finally realized that Aventurine was trying to con them. My explanation for my claim is largely because of the many assets in Darkfall Unholy Wars were reused assets from Darkfall 1, not to mention the class system unique to Unholy Wars was only partially implemented. So for all of us Darkfall hardcores who had been waiting for this Darkfall 2010 expansion to fix Darkfall 1, instead we had to buy this Darkfall rehashed with better graphics and class system thrown into the mix. Oh, and then it was called a different game, Darkfall Unholy Wars. Yeah, not many of us were buying it. Darkfall Unholy Wars was officially shut down on May 2016, 3 years after its initial launch. Its last year or 2 year of existence was much like Darkfall 1's, a shadow of its initial population. The largest difference with UW's demise was that the fans were devastated. They no longer had a chance to play Darkfall in any capacity. However, to back up a bit, In 2015, a group of dedicated DF1 fans made a petition to resurrect DF1. Aventurine shot down some of the initial ideas of this, but later stated that they were open to serious inquiries on the purchase of the Darkfall license. Two parties in specific were pushing for the purchase, but as separate entities. Uber Games, who dubbed their version Darkfall New Dawn, and Andrew of Big Picture Games, who named theirs Rise of Agon. The two groups made separate versions due to a difference in vision for the game. To start with New Dawn, Darkfall New Dawn was looking to be what the original Darkfall vision was, the one created by Claws way back when Razorwax was still around. While Rise of Agon was looking to expand upon the Darkfall that was present at the end of Darkfall 1, which was typically seen as a more hardcore experience, or at least more meta experience. New Dawn's philosophy was against big staples of Darkfall like global banking and bunny hopping. Global banking, of course, was that you could retrieve or place items into a bank no matter where you were, and bunny hopping was an unintentional feature of Darkfall 1 that had become, well, a staple of the game. New Dawn didn't outright remove bunny hopping, choosing to instead add penalties to it. Bunny hopping was basically the idea of taking a spell that had a pushback and using it on the ground and then properly timing your jumps to help propel you faster in the air. New Dawn also had the intention to make banking more local, where spawns and different monsters would drop more specific loot, and a proper economy in their eyes could be created. This was coupled with the no bindstone recall, which meant that you couldn't press a button and bind back to the base. The final change that New Dawn looked to implement was adding titles to the game. These would serve as the soft classes, where people could choose to focus on certain schools of magic or playstyles while not necessarily being forced to. These are the largest 4 changes in the game that split their audience from that of Rise of Agon's. New Dawn is currently in a playable beta, though not too many of their proposed large changes are present yet, which is likely why not many people are playing the game, even in beta. Still, if you check out their site and their vision, and you find it appealing to you, I would wait until they announce the launch of the game, which, at this point, who knows when that will be. Their vision is just a vision at this point. But that doesn't mean they can't pull it together. The Rise of Agon crowd mostly disliked these 4 changes that I previously mentioned. First, they thought bunny hopping was more of a skillful feature, regardless if it was unintentional or not. It allowed for small groups to escape from large groups. Second, they believed that local banking was not helpful for a niche game that was always going to struggle with having a large population, which is needed to have a local banking game. Not to mention that they believed that it would make the game much slower, what without bindstone recall and local banking, of course. And finally, the issue of titles. Many Agon fans perceive this as a rehash of the Darkfall Unholy Wars class system, which, despite me understanding their concerns, this is not really an accurate assessment. That's because these titles in New Dawn were optional, and titles already existed in Darkfall in the sense of Destroyer, Mage Hunter, and etc. These, however, are clunky and not really finished. They just offer arbitrary bonuses with not much thought to them. That's not a knock on their usability, but more so the idea of them being poorly executed. Rise of Agon focused more on its marketing, its new player experiences, and its desire to redesign the clunky UI and toolbar systems. Roa went for a more bare-bones approach, with what some would call a more realistic approach, though Roa does promise larger changes to come in the months following the launch of their game. Rise of Agon at this point is a lot more far along than New Dawn. As of today, it's been launched for nearly a month, and although it's had its share of server issues, the game has been able to boast a pretty healthy population, which is exciting for vets and new players alike who maybe never got a chance to play the game in the first place. Some would ask which is better, Rise of Agon versus New Dawn. Both audiences have their loyal ideas and name as well as fan bases, while there's certainly an audience somewhere in between who just want the game to work. They just want Darkfall to be successful. These people usually get drowned out in the extremes on both sides. I don't really want to get into which one is better. Roa currently is launched, and they went for more immediate small changes that improve the quality of life for the game. New Dawn has larger ambitions, looking to change the very fundamentals of Darkfall. largely because they believe the initial vision of Darkfall was poorly implemented, but also because they believe it will make the game more accessible to the general MMO public. ROA at its core is focusing more on having a readily available product, one that will satisfy the hardcore audience of Darkfall. Some would say New Dawn is a bit more casual, though in New Dawn's favor, they did manage to fix a lot of the lag issues associated with the combat in Darkfall. But that doesn't really get mentioned a lot, of course, because ROA is seen as the more hardcore version. If you want to check out either game, please check out the links in the description or the websites on screen. If you are interested in ROA, please use the link in the description to register your account, so I get a bit of a kickback in terms of in-game currency. Feel free to message me on Discord if you do end up signing up in ROA, so I can help you learn the game. With these two different companies focusing on their own reboots of the game, Darkfall isn't truly dead anymore, but the death of the original Darkfall Online is still the one that is in great dispute. Many people believe they know the reason or have the answers for why the game in question failed. And of course, these differences in opinion usually cause rifts in the community. But before I talk about the reasons that Darkfall Online failed, let's talk about what the legacy of Darkfall Online was. As I mentioned in the beginning of the video, Darkfall Online has always been a game that has had rabid fans. They feverishly defend the game against naysayers from the outside and are quick to stomp out people within the community who are negative about the game, even if they have good reason. In many ways, I consider the Darkfall populace to suffer from some sort of Stockholm Syndrome, with how poorly they were treated by Adventuring, but this is really because of their love for the game. Why was that love so strong? Large but scary world. The beauty of Darkfall has never been in its crude graphics, not in its poor and ancient interface, and certainly not in its age-old sounding sound effects and character voices. It was in the world itself. Darkfall was a massive world, a world that could take hours to traverse. It had a main continent with 4 different islands, but every region of the main continent was different. This was to account for the different races in the game, the elves called Murdain, the orcs, the wolves called Mahrim, the humans, the dwarves, and finally the dark elves called Alfar. Their different regions of territory had different flora, different terrain, and different architecture. But more so than the feel of these regions, there was something about the sense of wonder you would get when traversing the game. Whether it be through looking for chaos chests, treasure maps, or even looking to engage in forms of PvP, whether it be village raids, city raids, or PvP roaming parties. This wonder, of course, is fueled by the fear that at any moment you could lose your gear. You lose the money that you spent time and effort to gain, that cool item you found in a chest, and even more dire things. Your city could be attacked and sieged. You could be killed within your own city limits. Nowhere was safe in Darkfall, you always had to be on edge. And that's what made the game so damn fun. The brutalness of Darkfall was beautiful. Band together or fall. Since the inception of Darkfall, its forums have always been a battleground of such. You had to watch your tongue on the forums, lest you anger some other person who was part of another guild or alliance that would then declare war on you in game. But forum fall was more than just nerds comparing their eeping. It was a culture formed around the brutal game of Darkfall. Within Darkfall, when you spawned on your first day in the game, you felt that you were alone. Alone in this large, sometimes brutal world. Maybe you walked out of the city for the first time and someone who seemed friendly killed you in cold blood and looted all of your stuff. It taught people that they needed to band together. They needed to form clans, alliances, groups. They had to fight against the brutalness of the game. Forum Fraud brought this to the next level, because losing inside the game wasn't where it ended. If you lost a fight or a siege, it was on display on the forum. You had to live with that. It made people work harder. It made people work more together. They were afraid of becoming next on someone's highlight reel, or their clan suffering in an agonizing defeat. But ultimately, it made people band together. Many of the original clans and alliances in Darkfall still exist to this day. Darkfall surely created many friendships, enemies, and somewhere in between. Combat. probably the most impactful part of Darkfall's legacy. Combat in Darkfall Online was like playing Quake with MMORPG skills. Stat management from Asheron's Call. A Twitch aim player could show off their aim through the use of bows and spells that all projectiles that you could see flying through the air. But if they had poor ability choice or placement, they would still do poorly in the game. Or a player with poor aim but strong MMORPG skills and stat management could still be relevant in the game. The game allowed for so many different types of players. This made the smaller engagements super exciting because when you consider that the game was full loot, you were engaged in these battles you really cared about. You cared about the outcome because you didn't want to lose your stuff. Not to mention you could have these massive siege battles, with at the peak of Darkfall was almost 1,000 players on screen at the same time fighting over a massive city, graves everywhere, arrows and spells whizzing through the air, people looting graves in the middle of war zones, mounts on the horizon, siege vehicles, siege cannons. It was just chaos. You can say what you want about Darkfall and how it looks dated, but nobody can knock its combat. The combat was fun, and it's the reason why many Darkfall fans still rabidly defend the game to this day. David versus Goliath. How could you not love the story of a privately owned company developing a full loot MMO with tons of sandbox features in the age of games like World of Warcraft and EverQuest? These were PvE games. Not many PvP fans were going to find a lot to do in these games. Not to mention, Adventuring was a new company. They didn't have a publisher. They didn't have funding. They did, however, have this grand vision of a game they wanted to create, a game that was based on open PvP, a vision that many of the fans of the game shared. It's fun to root for the underdog sometimes. Causes are founded on such things, of course. And a ragtag group of foreigners in a country like Greece who didn't really have any notable gaming country to begin with was the epitome of an underdog story. And we all wanted Darkfall to succeed. Now that you have an understanding of the legacy of Darkfall 1, let's take a look at the largest contributing factors to the death of Darkfall Online. Grind, 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 and the pressure to perform. I won't really mention the terrible launch that Darkfall had, as I already outlined that in the history portion. But how do you stop players from realizing that there's a lot of missing features in the game, or that the game lacks the depth that you advertised it to have? Simple. Put an innumerable amount of grind in front of them, and hope that none of them can do it too quickly. At least that's my theory on why Darkfall devs went from advertising the game with no grinding to having one of the worst grinds ever. This was not what the original vision of Darkfall was. As Klaus said in the interview I linked earlier in the video, the concept was for it not to be about grinding. Their vision, of course, failed to realize, and the penalty was to be viable in Darkfall, you had to do an insane amount of grinding. This then led to people trying to find ways to circumvent it, and the ways they found were exploits. Now, the bulk of these exploits were about methods that abused the AI in the game, but there were also more intricate things like macros that would help you skill up while AFK, swim macros that helped raise your stats, and even something called a blood wall, which essentially was a bunch of alts healing each other while you practiced your spells and abilities on them. This bled tons of players, because many people simply weren't okay with being forced to glitch your exploit or macro to compete against other players, especially in a game that is full loot, where if you don't do the things other people are doing to get ahead, you're going to be killed by those players and lose all the stuff that you had on you. This was bad especially in early Darkfall, because magic was so extremely powerful that a mage with surged spells and nukes could murder entire groups of players. And how did the community react to some people quitting because of this? Well, some told them that they should just stop crying and adapt, and that macroing and exploiting went on for just about all of Darkfall and you should just get used to it. Yeah. Holes were appearing in the boat, and instead of adventuring plugging them, they would just continue to build a bigger boat and question why people kept leaving this sinking ship. Where to start with adventuring? We certainly have to commend them for creating the vision for Darkfall in the first place, and being able to create the game without a publisher and without funding. But just because someone creates a product that you like, doesn't mean that you can't be critical of it, and it certainly doesn't mean that you can't be critical of the company who created it. In the case of Adventuring, they gave players many reasons to hate them, and this starts as early as 2001, where Aventurine first announced the game would launch in 2003. And mind you that they admitted that this was a guess, but the pushbacks don't end there. An announcement on July 11th, 2006 stated that preparations were being made to begin a beta. They also went on to say that if they could not secure a publisher, that they would end up self-publishing the game. They then went and said that the stable beta build was still running on remote servers. If you remember back at the history portion of the video, I mentioned how the first beta announcement happened in July 2006. 6 months later, they stated that the beta was running on a remote server. That's complete bull. The actual beta wasn't even playable for 2 more years. 2 years! And although Aventurine could claim the goalposts moved, and that they had increased the scope of the game or whatever, why did they keep giving these false deadlines? Because they wanted people to think the game was still coming out? They were digging their own grave. It's much better to under-promise and over-perform than the vice versa. You might wonder how I can substantiate some of these claims. Well, it's simple. I don't just think Aventurine promised deadlines and didn't perform on them. That happens, that's pretty normal. Sometimes people don't perform on deadlines. I think that they promised them and knew that they wouldn't perform on them. In the slide, Tassos stated in the PowerPoint that the technology took 3 years to create, 3 years for the actual Darkfall game. The game was announced back in 2001-2002. That means right after they created the tech portion of the game, they already announced the beta for the game on 2006. So the game took itself another 3 years? That fits the timeline, since the game then comes out in 2009. But it also admits that Tassos admitted to lying, or at least not really being truthful. Sometimes companies make mistakes, sometimes they promise things and don't deliver. The reason why Aventurine gets so much a negative rep is A, they're notorious at it, B, anytime they were asked to explain themselves, they were either met with silence or some bullshit excuse. Say this next quote from Tassos Flamboyant himself. Regrettably, we've had to pass up many publicity opportunities in the past year. Due to the hardcore development focus, the limited showcase capability, and the very limited time to spend on anything other than development. But the main reason that we've decided that it's time to show Darkfall, rather than keep talking about it, we believe that it will speak for itself better than we ever could. It's impossible to compete head-on with the coverage and professional buzz generated by marketing, media, and PR departments working for the big games. We've dedicated our resource to development, knowing that our game can compete a lot better than the publicity can. Once we've shown what we can do, I believe that what we will say will make a bigger impact, which is just bull. I mean, Aventurine constantly made this point. You have to understand, when you announce a product to the public, you are opening yourself up to criticism, especially when you are asking your customers to pay you money, and then wait on the product when you delay it over and over again. The quote is the equivalent of a toddler putting their hands over their ears when met with criticism, and a company should not operate like this. This is something that Aventurine continued to do for nearly a decade. Anytime they were met with negative feedback or people asking for them to, I don't know, say what they were doing, say for example in the handling of Darkfall 2010, or Darkfall Arena, or Darkfall 2.0, or, well, Darkfall Unholy Wars. Darkfall 2010 was the original name, but the expansion was supposed to launch in 2010. When that didn't happen and they were constantly pressed about it, they didn't say anything, they kept giving vague answers, and then renamed it Darkfall Arena, and, well, the fans kept calling it Darkfall 2010 hilariously. But then this expansion again was pushed back, twice in a row. After over 2 years after its announcement, there was finally footage shown for the expansion in the form of a visual video. Fans grew suspicious. They were unable to get answers from Aventurine. They started to assume that this supposed expansion was more than an expansion. They started to believe that it was a sequel. When they asked Tassos about that, Tassos said word for word, "We haven't diverted resources to a Darkfall 2 game." And then in late 2012, a few months later, they announced that they were indeed making a sequel, with a video that showed Tassos deadpanning away from the camera, reading a press report with absolutely no energy or life to him, almost as if he was pissed that he had to explain himself to the mere peasants who were paying his bills and supporting his game for 2 years without serious updates. Yeah, that's not to mention the multiple side projects they were also working on, all the while the Darkfall players were begging for changes to happen to Darkfall and sitting around watching their game slowly die. It's just poor handling by Aventurine all around the board. And I'm sure there's more documented mess-ups of Aventurine too, but I'm a bit heavy-handed in my criticism. But that's because this is coming from someone who wished Darkfall success since 2007. I really wished the game would do well, and I really rooted for Adventuring, that they would turn things around, even after all of that negative press and just terrible shadiness behind the whole Darkfall Unholy Wars, Darkfall 2010 expansion thing. But my praise for them stops at their ability to launch the game, because their inability to accept criticism, and even be open to it period, really turned me off from them as a company. It's hard to feel sorry for Adventuring. They dug their own grave. It just sucks that they had to take such a great idea like Darkfall down with them. Well, at least its original iteration. Maybe the game will still live on. Balance issues and the legend of Magefall. Magefall is something that can surely have the Darkfall community up in arms. If you even mention the name Magefall, people will label you a noob or an idiot. The truth is, Magefall was a thing. It was a massive issue early in Darkfall's release because people were able to cycle high-level nukes quite easily and do full damage even if the nuke itself landed on the ground. This is a large reason for massive alliances like the Mercs quitting, as OCM, the leader of the Mercs, admitted as much in his little manifesto. Mages dominated early Darkfall, and it wasn't even close. And while the R90 nuke cycling was eventually fixed, many people thought that this is where the reign of the mages ended. But that's where the Darkfall population continues to be delusional. Mage does not need to hit you in the back to knock you up. They can hit you by proxy with their shot, something an archer can't do. Not to mention, if an archer player, or more correctly in Darkfall terms called a destroyer, goes out to PvP, they have to bring a pretty heavy bag of loot, while a mage just needs to have a good staff and a bone set, which is relatively cheap, to be competitive. Some think due to the grind a mage has that this is equal. Those are also delusional. Because if you want to judge the game on its end game, then a destroyer has to put way more effort into their bank than a mage does. Not to mention a mage gets all the utility in Darkfall, as well as numerous blinds and knockups. This is why balance in Darkfall is so terrible, and why it certainly hurt the population of the game, and possibly led to its death. Not everyone wants to play the same archetype, and surely not everyone wants to grind everything to be relevant. The original vision for Darkfall, as admitted by Klaus, the original lead developer, the game was supposed to be surely fast-paced and all, but the game was supposed to have a reward for having a specific playstyle. Instead, since everyone can grind all schools of magic and use them all with no penalty, the only classes in Darkfall are the Mage Hybrid or the Destroyer. This is not diversity. And although some would say, well, technically you don't have to level all the spells or schools. That's like saying you don't need to diversify your assets when investing. Sure, you don't have to, but you're pointlessly gimping yourself if you don't. This is an issue that still to this day can make the Darkfall community respond in anger, and I'm absolutely flabbergasted as to why. There wasn't supposed to be a grind in Darkfall. It was supposed to be a game where you could choose how you want to play it. How did Ultima Online or Asheron's Call, which are both games that the developers of Darkfall attributed much of Darkfall to, deal with this issue? They had a skill cap. Yes, it was that simple. You still had the openness of non-class combat systems and non-class based leveling. You had tons of diversity. But in Darkfall, no diversity. Because everyone was the same two colors, especially when certain magic skills were directly better than others. It's completely illogical how some of the Darkfall fans cling to this. When both UO and AC had skill caps, and Darkfall didn't and still doesn't? The game just looks silly in comparison. Self-cannibalization and the nature of Darkfall. This is my final point, and my final point for good reason. This is probably my most controversial stance throughout this entire video. Many people will point to full loot as being the reason that Darkfall failed, at least many haters of PvP. They say PvP-focused MMOs are destined to fail, and I think that's completely off base. But just because I mostly disagree, doesn't mean that there's a little bit of truth there. The reason full loot games hemorrhage their population so much is typically because there are not systems in place that stop this from happening. Darkfall surely suffered from this. They didn't have proper systems in place to stop people from bind camping newbies, from healing mobs while they killed new players, and etc. This certainly bled some of its less hardcore population, and that's been a core issue of Darkfall. The game cannot entirely be made of wolves. Wolves need sheep to eat. If a predator has no prey, the predators turn on each other until eventually there is no one left. The end days of Darkfall were spent waiting on sieges to happen and dueling in cities, when the core of the game was about being out in the world, exploring things, having fights over territory, and etc. The sheep simply aren't willing to cheat to get ahead, macro for days, and push through extreme grinds to actually start to enjoy playing the game. So when the sheep left Darkfall, so did the vast majority of the population of the game. And what was Darkfall community's response to some of these complaints that the sheep had? To berate them and make them feel bad. If you disagreed about mechanics in the game, mechanics that didn't logically make much sense, you were deemed a non-factor or an idiot. You don't like the idea of an unintentional mechanic like bunny hopping being core to the game? Tough luck. Get good. Probably means you just suck at it. You don't like the idea that although the game boasts an open skill system, it devolves to everyone with the same abilities and skills and everyone having to do the same innumerable amount of grind? Tough luck. You probably just suck, or you don't have enough time, or you just don't know how to grind properly. If Aventurine had the correct systems to keep sheep playing, perhaps at least the population would have remained. But for how much longer? With a self-cannibalizing community, I highly doubt the attrition could have been completely stopped. I love the Darkfall community because it's unique, but many of the players are too daft to understand the change needed to happen for the game to do well. And hopefully this is something that the 2 new reboots can fix. If not, history may repeat itself. I must say that I have seen Darkfall players since then in the new Darkfall reboots, hardcore players, the same hardcore players who used to bash those who complained about issues with Darkfall, they seem to be a bit more objective now, even willing to help new players learn the game, so it seems like things are uptrending. But only time can tell. Hopefully after reaching the end of this video, you have a better understanding of why Darkfall Online failed, and why its legacy was important for the video game industry. Darkfall was certainly a game I regarded highly, flaws and all, but as this video can serve for others, it helps serve as a sort of cathartic release for me. Maybe I can finally move past my ill feelings towards Aventurine, and my nostalgic feelings for Darkfall Online. I don't know how optimistic I am for the future of the Darkfall reboots, especially with strong sandboxes such as Camelot Unchained and Crowfall on the horizon, but I wish them the best, and I will continue to play Rise of Agon for at least the time being. If you liked the video and would like to see more Death of a Game videos or videos like them, please hit that subscribe button. If you want updates on when my next videos will be, follow my Twitter. If you want to watch me stream sometime, you can follow my Twitch, which I will start to stream on more towards the end of the year and make that a more regular thing. Feel free to join the channel Discord, where you can meet a group of like-minded gamers and discuss current gaming topics, as well as find people to play games with. If you want to support me more, please visit my Patreon link, where you can help support me monetarily, or you can use my Amazon affiliate link, where I get a bit of a kickback from such, and it adds no extra charge to your purchase. That's all I have for you guys. Thanks for sitting through this long video, one of my longest yet, and shoutouts to my 2 editors on this video. I'm only going to be choosing one of those, and you guys will only get to see the end result after this is published. But shout out to those guys for being willing to help me. That's all I have. nerdSlayer, out.